I knew there was something that from what things I've witnessed about him.
When Michael Jackson died on June 25, 2009, the official story was delivered quickly. One doctor, one drug, a tragic accident. Conrad Murray administered propofol, left the room, and by the time he came back his patient had stopped breathing. Case closed, conviction secured, the world moved on. But there were two men who had spent the previous 2.5 years with Michael Jackson virtually every single day. Men who were in the room, in the car, in the hotel corridors, outside the bedroom door. Men who watched him eat breakfast with his children, who drove him through Las Vegas in disguise at 2 in the morning, who heard the things he said in private. When the performance was over and the cameras were gone, their names were Bill Whitfield and Javon Beard. They were Michael Jackson's personal bodyguards from December 2006 until his death in June 2009. And what they have said in interviews, in testimony, and in their 2014 book Remember the Time, Protecting Michael Jackson in His Final Days, directly challenges some of the most widely repeated assumptions about what really happened to the most famous entertainer who ever lived. This is the story of what Bill Whitfield and Javon Beard actually witnessed, what they say the world got wrong about Michael Jackson's death, and why the men who were physically closest to him in his final years believe the official narrative, as clean and as legalese as it may appear, does not come close to telling the complete story. Bill Whitfield was hired as Michael Jackson's head of security in December 2006. Javon Beard joined shortly afterward. Together, they formed the primary protective detail around Michael Jackson and his 3 children during what turned out to be the final years of his life. These were not peripheral figures in his world. They were present virtually around the clock. They traveled with him between Las Vegas, New Jersey, and eventually Los Angeles. They knew his routines, his habits, his fears, and his private emotional state across a period of nearly 3 years. When Michael Jackson could not sleep and called someone just to have another human voice in the room at 2 in the morning, he called them. Whitfield has described the nature of that closeness in terms that are simultaneously moving and revealing. He has said consistently that he did not work for the King of Pop. He worked for Mr. Jackson, the man, the person, the father. That distinction between the public icon and the private human being is the foundation of everything he and Beard have said publicly about Michael Jackson's life and death. Their 2014 book became significant not because it made dramatic accusations or claimed to have secret evidence. It became significant because it provided a sustained, detailed, first-hand account of what Michael Jackson's daily life actually looked like from the closest possible vantage point, and because that account was substantially different from the version the press had been constructing for years. Whitfield in particular has continued giving interviews across the years. Since the book was published, most recently in 2026 around the time of the Michael biopic premiere, and his account has remained consistent across all of them. He is not someone telling a different story every time he speaks. He is someone telling the same story, with the same details, with the same conviction, and with the same clarity about what he witnessed and what he believes it means. In a 2026 interview, Whitfield was asked about his reaction to the Michael biopic and whether he planned to be part of the celebrations surrounding its release. His answer was pointed and immediate. He said very few people were actually around during those years, and he said it was hard for him to watch a celebration of Michael Jackson's life when he kept asking himself where all those celebratory people had been when they were on the road. And Michael needed actual support. That frustration, quiet but unmistakable, runs through everything Whitfield has said publicly since 2009. The first and most significant thing Bill Whitfield has said publicly about Michael Jackson's death is that reducing it to one doctor and one drug misses something fundamental about what was actually happening to the man in those final months. In a 2019 appearance on The Today Show, Whitfield said directly that he believed stress played a major role in Michael Jackson's death. He said that being privy to some of the conversations Michael was having and witnessing the pressure he was under from every direction during the This Is It tour preparation period led him to believe that the chronic, relentless stress of those months was a significant contributor to the physical breakdown that ultimately proved fatal. This is not a fringe or speculative claim. It is consistent with what the medical testimony presented at Conrad Murray's trial also suggested. Harvard sleep expert Dr. Charles Czeisler testified that Michael Jackson had gone 60 consecutive nights without real REM sleep before his death, a condition that on its own represented a serious threat to his physical and neurological health. The propofol was the final element in an already severely compromised physical situation. Whitfield's account adds the human dimension to that medical picture. He describes a man who was being driven toward a massive commercial event that he was not physically or emotionally ready for, whose financial situation created pressure that left him very little room to slow down or stop, who was surrounded by people whose interests were tied to the tour proceeding, which meant that nobody with real daily access to him had a strong incentive to say publicly that he was not well enough to do what was being asked of him. The lie Whitfield is exposing is not a dramatic conspiracy. It is something quieter and in some ways more troubling. It is the lie of a simple, contained narrative that lets everyone around Michael Jackson off the hook for what they knew, what they saw, and what they chose not to do about it. UK bodyguard and longtime friend Matt Fittis described a phone call he received just days before Jackson's death in which Michael was reportedly begging for help, saying he was being forced to rehearse beyond his physical limit. Fittis attempted to escalate his concerns to Joseph Jackson. He got voicemail. He later described the Michael Jackson he had spoken to in those final weeks as erratic, underweight, and desperate. The commercial machine surrounding the tour was running at full speed. The human being inside it was falling apart at exactly the same time. One of the most persistent myths about Michael Jackson's final years is the image of a man surrounded by devoted people who cared about him. The entourage, the inner circle, the team. The impression that someone with his level of fame and resources must have had genuine, reliable human support around him at all times. Javon Beard demolished that image in one of the most quietly devastating lines in the entire Remember the Time book. He said that never in the whole time he worked for Michael Jackson did he hear anybody just call him up to say, "Hey, guess what movie I saw?" There was nothing like that. It was just business. Let that sit for a moment. The best-selling artist in the history of recorded music. A man whose name was recognized in every country on earth, and not one person in his life called him simply to talk, simply to check in, simply because they wanted to hear his voice without needing something from him. Whitfield has described Michael Jackson warning them about this himself when they first started working for him. He told them directly to watch, because now the vultures were going to start showing up. He had spent decades learning to read the difference between people who genuinely cared about him and people who wanted access to what being near him could provide. And by the final years of his life, by his own assessment, almost everyone in his immediate circle fell into the second category. The birthday party Whitfield and Beard described in their Good Morning America interview in 2010 became one of the most referenced details from their account because it captured the reality of his isolation in a single image. When Michael threw a birthday party for one of his children, the guests were Michael, the teacher, the nanny, and the 3 bodyguards. No other children attended. No friends came. No family showed up. Just the people who were employed to be there. Whitfield said the children did not even know their father was being called Wacko Jacko in the press. Michael had removed all internet access from the house and did not allow regular television, specifically to protect them from seeing how he was being portrayed publicly. He was building a bubble around his family, not out of eccentricity, but out of a very rational understanding of how damaging the outside narrative about him was, and a determination to keep his children insulated from it for as long as he possibly could. Whitfield also revealed that death threats and security scares were a constant, largely unreported feature of Michael Jackson's daily existence during those years. He described receiving threatening letters at hotel front desks and making the call to leave in the middle of the night without anyone knowing. He said the children never knew what was happening during those midnight departures. They just thought they were making another move. Michael Jackson's specific and documented concern during all of those situations was always the same. Keep the craziness away from his kids. Try to give them something resembling a normal life inside an existence that was anything but. One of the most significant pieces of testimony Bill Whitfield has given in his various interviews concerns Michael Jackson's private feelings about the 1993 civil settlement with the Chandler family, a settlement that was paid at approximately $25 million, and that has been cited ever since by people on both sides of the debate about his character as evidence for their respective positions. Whitfield has been direct about what Michael Jackson told him privately on this subject. He said Michael told him directly that he had not wanted to settle, that he wanted to fight the case in court, that he had been advised by the people around him that settling was the faster and less damaging path, that the story would go away and the career could continue, and that he had taken that advice against his own instincts and regretted it for the rest of his life. Whether or not that account fully reflects the legal and strategic reality of that situation, it reflects something important about Michael Jackson's internal experience of it. He felt that the settlement had been used ever since as implicit evidence of guilt, when from his own perspective it had been a business decision made by advisors, not an admission of wrongdoing by him. The gap between what the settlement looked like from outside and what it felt like from inside was something he carried with significant emotional weight. Whitfield has also spoken about Michael Jackson's consistent and repeated private assertions of innocence. He describes conversations in which Michael would bring up the subject unprompted, simply saying that he would never hurt a child, that he would never, and expressing those convictions with an intensity that Whitfield described as something beyond practiced or performance. He was someone who needed people around him to know who he actually was, partly because the public version had diverged so far from his own experience of himself. Whitfield said he believed the allegations and the settlement and the years of sustained public speculation about the subject had crushed Michael Jackson in ways that never fully healed, that the damage to his sense of himself, to his ability to trust people, and to his capacity to simply exist in public without that history following him into every room, was something that built across years into a weight that the physical demands of the "this is it" comeback could not be separated from. The stress that Whitfield described as a contributor to his death was not abstract. It had a specific source. It was the stress of a man who had been publicly accused, publicly tried in the court of public opinion, privately devastated, and never fully permitted by the world around him to put any of it down. Whitfield recalled specific moments when Michael Jackson would ask them directly if they had heard people saying something very mean about him during their travels. He and Beard would say no, even when they had heard exactly that, because Whitfield understood that confirming it would have sent Michael immediately looking for the next flight out of wherever they were. The emotional fragility that Whitfield describes was not the fragility of a weak person. It was the fragility of someone who had absorbed an extraordinary amount of sustained public cruelty and who had never had access to the kind of genuine, consistent emotional support that would have helped him process it. Bill Whitfield said something in a 2026 interview that captures everything he and Javon Beard have been trying to say since they published their book 12 years earlier. He said he had no plans to participate in the celebrations surrounding the Michael biopic. He said very few people were around during those final years, and he said it was hard for him to celebrate because it just made him wonder where all those people were when they were on the road traveling, and where was the support for Michael at that time. That question, where was the support, is the thread that runs through every account Bill Whitfield has given about Michael Jackson's final years. Not a conspiracy theory about who administered what drug or who had what financial motive. Something more fundamental and more damning than that. A question about why the most famous person in the world spent his final years calling his bodyguards late at night just to have someone to talk to, while the people who claimed to love him were unreachable unless they needed something. The lies Whitfield exposes about Michael Jackson's death are not lies in the dramatic headline-grabbing sense. They are lies of omission. The lie that Conrad Murray acting alone is a sufficient explanation for what happened to a man whose body and mind had been under systematic, sustained, and largely unaddressed pressure for years. The lie that he was surrounded by a support network that cared about him. The lie that the legal settlements and public allegations that followed him for the last 16 years of his life had not done damage that medical records and toxicology reports could not fully capture. What Whitfield and Beard actually witnessed in 2.5 years of being physically present in Michael Jackson's daily life was a man who was far more isolated, far more emotionally burdened, and far more physically depleted than the world understood. And what they have been saying, consistently and without contradiction, since 2010 is that any honest account of why Michael Jackson died has to include all of that alongside the single drug and the single doctor that the official story used to close the case. What do you think about what Bill Whitfield has revealed about Michael Jackson's final years and what really contributed to his death? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Like this video, subscribe, and turn on notifications, because there is still more of this story worth telling. The record Whitfield and Beard left behind in Remember the Time is not a perfect document. They were employees. They had their own perspective and their own relationship with Michael Jackson that shaped what they noticed and what they chose to include. But they were also the two people who were physically present when almost no one else was. And what they witnessed, documented, and have continued to describe consistently across more than 15 years of interviews, is a picture of a man who deserved far more than he received from the industry that built him, the people who surrounded him, and the world that claimed to love him while leaving him to navigate the last years of his life almost entirely alone.